Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. This episode is the start of a new season, and our focus will be on historical philosophers and their views on free will, moral responsibility, and agency.
These 10 episodes of this season will look at some of the most influential Western philosophers from the ancient and medieval periods.
We start in this episode with Plato, and we talk with Eric Brown about Plato's views on freedom, moral psychology, and responsibility.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Eric Brown, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis. Eric's research is mainly on ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, but he also works on topics in ethics. He's written extensively on Plato, especially on Plato's ethics and politics in the Republic, including a general entry on that topic for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He's also written on several other figures and topics, Epicurus, Cynicism, and Stoicism. And he has a book called Stoic Cosmopolitanism that's forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. But today, we're excited to talk about all things Plato. So welcome to the show, Eric. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on Plato?
Sure. Thanks, Taylor. Thanks for inviting me to the conversation. I got interested in philosophy in high school. I was really interested in debate and in reading, and I had a good philosophy class. And I liked to read and to argue about what I was reading. And I wanted to do more of that in college. I didn't know then that I wanted to major in philosophy because I was very much inspired by some of the fiction and history I was reading too. But in college, in my first year gen ed kinds of classes, my professors convinced me I should take philosophy, and I took philosophy and I really loved it. So I kept doing that. I didn't really come to ancient Greek philosophy until graduate school. In about my second year, I drifted over to Greek philosophy, in large part because the kind of ethical questions I was, kind of philosophical questions I was most interested in were ethical. And I was kind of underwhelmed by recent work in ethics and inspired by Plato and Aristotle and the people and recent philosophers who were most inspiring to me were themselves deeply connected to the Greeks. So people like Bernard Williams or Iris Murdoch or Philippa Foot. So I decided to just, read some Greek philosophy, and that's what I did.
Nice.
Yeah, very cool. Probably most of our listeners have heard of Plato, but could you start by giving a bit of historical context for our discussion? When did Plato live? What philosophers was he influenced by? And what are some of the most widely read texts or any other background information that you might think that's helpful?
Sure. So Plato was born in Athens in the early 420s before the Common Era, just after Athens and its allies went to war with Sparta and its allies. And those wars, the Peloponnesian Wars, they lasted until Plato was about 25 years old. So that has to have made a big difference to him growing up in wartime. The 50 years before the wars were Athens' golden age, the best time to be an Athenian ever. They invented tragedy, they built the Parthenon, relative peace and prosperity. But then the wars were just devastating. By the end of the wars, Athens' population was about half what it was before the wars. And by the end of the wars, democracy was dead, and the government was a junta of 30 people that were pro-Spartan. And that 30 included members of Plato's family. So again, this is kind of tricky. Now, fortunately, the 30 wasn't in power very long. The democracy was restored. But unfortunately, under the democracy, the citizens decided to charge the person that Plato most admired, Socrates, with corrupting the youth. And they convicted him of that, and they sentenced him to death. So Plato enters adulthood having gone through all kinds of discombobulating experiences, and in a city that's kind of rife with political disagreement and greatly weakened by decades of war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, philosophically, the most important influence on Plato by far is Socrates. And the rest of Plato's life, the next 50 years or so, was dedicated to what he admired most about Socrates. He was trying to emulate Socrates' love of wisdom. So Plato, like several other friends of Socrates, they wrote works to depict Socrates in action, Socratic dialogues, they're often called. And this was supposed to show what it was to live as a philosopher. Plato also started a school in Athens to attract bright young people who were interested in pursuing wisdom with him. So obviously, that's the most important philosophical influence on Plato. Here, I think, Socrates just sort of gives Plato the idea that you could dedicate yourself to becoming wise and just above everything else. Before Socrates, around Socrates, there were a lot of other people who were smart, and they were making interesting claims about the natural world or about how to live. But these people, they were presenting themselves as wise. And they were typically recognized as wise. There was a whole tradition of the 7 sages, complete with books of sayings. And in the 5th century, that's Socrates' century, there were lots of clever intellectuals that were called sophistae, or experts. But especially as Plato depicts him, Socrates is not an expert. He does not present himself as wise. He presents himself as lacking wisdom, and indeed seemed to think that no human being was wise, though it would be best for us to be wise. And so he presents himself as committed above all to becoming wise, trying to pursue wisdom. And that sort of invents the idea of a philosophical life. He also committed himself to being just above all. And he was convinced that he was surrounded by people in Athens who were much too materialistic and greedy to be just. And he seems to have thought that was true, not just about Athenians individually, but about Athens collectively. It was Athens' imperialistic greed that got them into war in the first place. So the young people like Plato who were drawn to Socrates, he must have sounded like some sort of prophet, like a herald of an entirely different way of life. Plato's growing up in a world gone to hell, and it must have seemed a very powerful message to hear from Socrates that he could live a different way by pursuing wisdom and justice. Now, I'm emphasizing the Socratic background because I do think it's by far the most important thing to understand about Plato. But Plato also paid a lot of attention to other clever speakers. He paid attention to the sophists or experts like Gorgias and Protagoras. He sought out works by earlier speculators about nature like Heraclitus and Parmenides. And at some point, he became aware of the Pythagorean communities that had been set up in the southern Italian peninsula. Our sources tell us that he traveled there, and he went to Sicily as well. His dialogues, and that's what we have from him. And quite surprisingly, we have everything he wrote. That's highly unusual for ancient literature.
Yeah.
His dialogues show a lot of engagement with Gorgias, Protagoras, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and they also show attraction to ideas that we think of as Pythagorean. So that's the main philosophical background to Plato.
Thanks. That's great and super helpful. I think it's pretty hard to overstate Plato's influence in Western philosophy and in other disciplines besides philosophy too, like in political science and theology, among others. What would you say are some of Plato's most influential ideas?
The very first one, I think, is just the idea of philosophy. Basically, his dialogues in his school, the academy, they essentially defined what philosophy is for subsequent philosophers. They worked it out that wisdom requires 3 kinds of understanding. First, you have to understand how the world works. That's expertise about nature. They called it physique or physics. Second, you have to understand how to live. That's expertise about character, ethicae or ethics. And third, you have to understand how to achieve understanding. And that's expertise about language and reason, logikae or logic. All the subsequent Greek philosophers conceived of philosophy in exactly these terms, as a search for understanding in physics, ethics, and logic. We see this not only in Plato's most famous pupil, Aristotle, but also in the Stoic and Epicurean schools that developed in the century after Plato died. Because of that influence, virtually all the questions and most of the answers developed by Aristotle, Stoics, and Epicureans can be found in Plato's dialogues. And given how important all these Greek philosophers were to later philosophers in the Arabic and Latin traditions, and then again in the Renaissance, Plato's fingerprints are just all over a wide swath of the world's philosophy. But here it's also, I think, important to remember that Plato wrote dialogues. And he didn't write didactic poetry like some earlier thinkers, and he didn't write treatises like, say, Aristotle, which I guess is one way to characterize what we have from Aristotle. Aristotle's texts are strange.
Right.
But Plato's works don't directly express what he thinks about how best to pose and answer philosophical questions. They just don't do that. They don't tell you what Plato's thinking. They instead depict some imaginary but realistic conversations in which philosophical questions are posed and answered. And most of these conversations involve Socrates explicitly encouraging others to do more philosophical thinking, to ask more questions, and to seek better answers. So the dialogues themselves don't tell the reader what to think. Rather, they invite the reader to think about how the conversation's going, to think about how it might have gone better, and to think about where it could go next. And so we'll see that there are some readers of Plato that take him in very strange directions. Like less than 100 years after Plato died, some readers decided that the take-home message of his dialogues is that there are always opposing answers to questions. And the philosophical response to such opposing answers is just to suspend judgment.
Right.
And that's how Plato's Academy invented skepticism. And then another batch of readers, this is in the 3rd century of the Common Era, they found a very different take-home message in Plato's dialogues. Here the key figure is a guy called Plotinus. And Plotinus and his followers extracted from Plato's work a remarkably abstruse metaphysical account of the world and of how best to live. Their Platonism is what scholars often call Neoplatonism, but it was enormously important to the development of Christian theology and philosophy. Remember, Christianity didn't yet have a doctrinal definition, and it totally changed in the 4th century when it got a doctrinal definition and massive institutional power in the Roman Empire. So in late antiquity, in fact, the main philosophical debate was not between Platonists and other philosophers, but among Platonists. It was between the Christian Platonists and the so-called pagan Platonists. That's how influential Plato still was going on a millennium after his death.
Right.
So Plato, he exerts this massive influence indirectly through other philosophers, but he also continues to exert massive influence directly because his dialogues are about the best introduction to philosophy there is. So a lot of philosophers come to philosophy through Plato. But if you're asking, so that's just to say, explain your question, Taylor. Like what? How influential is he? And that kind of question.
Yeah.
But you also asked, like, what particularly is he known for? Well, besides all of philosophy, I think what you could say is that a Platonic approach to physics kind of prioritizes what's intelligible and unchangeable, the kinds of answers that are essentially mathematical, over what's perceptible and changeable. And if you're going to have a Platonic account of ethics, you'll prioritize psychological harmony and coherence among all our mental attitudes. And if you were to give a Platonic account of logic, you would prioritize dialectic. That's to say, Socratic conversation and question and answer that challenges the tenability of the answers. These, broadly speaking, are very Platonic approaches to the main 3 areas of philosophy as the Academy understood it. And they're massively influential themselves. Like the the Platonic approach to physics is essential to modern science. The Platonic approach to ethics is probably still the most plausible program in ethics. And the dialectical approach to logic is still kind of what we think of as philosophical inquiry. So it's pretty influential.
Right.
Yeah. Well, this is a podcast about free will. And so in an episode on Plato, we want to ask about Plato's views on free will, moral responsibility, and related topics that have come up on the show before. Some scholars think Plato doesn't even have a view on free will, and that this debate emerges much later, perhaps with the Stoics, and certainly by the time that you get to Augustine. Do you think this is right? Does Plato say anything about the will, freedom, agential control, or anything else that might be of interest for thinking about free will?
I do share the thought that the free will question is one of the few philosophical questions not in Plato's dialogues. There's no intimation in the dialogues that our practices of holding each other responsible are somehow problematic if we don't have a will that's free. There's no intimation in the dialogues that the existence of a divine being is somehow untenable or unthinkable if we don't have a will that's free. In fact, Plato's dialogues, in those dialogues, there's no faculty or power that you could easily identify as a will at all. But the dialogues do gesture toward a conception of freedom that's internal or psychological, to be contrasted with external or political freedom. And on this psychological account of freedom, the dialogue suggests that a soul is free when it does what it, in its own nature, wants. And it's not free if it does what the body wants. So this view kind of just depends on a contrast between the soul itself, which is immortal and which wants to understand, and the body, which is ultimately the source of a wide range of other desires, including especially appetitive desires for food, drink, and sex, but also, strangely, including desires for honor and wealth. Now, sometimes, like in the Phaedo, one of Plato's dialogues, Plato's Socrates is content to leave it at that, contrast between the soul and its desires and the body and its desires, which is weird thinking about the body having desires. But on other occasions, he will internalize those bodily desires and make them into lower parts of the soul, parts the soul has only when it's embodied. And when he does that, for example, in the Republic, he can say that a soul is free when it rules itself, when it rules the lower parts of the soul in particular, and it's not free when it's enslaved to appetites or to honor or to wealth or to some other embodied concern. Now, these passages about internal freedom, which are most explicit in the Phaedo and the Republic, they do suggest a concern for agential control, which you hear a lot about among inquirers into free will.
That's right, yeah.
But notice that freedom on this account is not a metaphysical property that either does or does not belong to all human souls. It is a special achievement. It belongs to those few souls that are well ordered. Moreover, this freedom that is an achievement of the whole soul. He'll say the rational soul is free and unenslaved only if the whole soul is well ordered. So myself, I don't think that Plato's notion of internal freedom is very well suited to become the source of the libertarian's idea of a free will, although other, compatibilists say might like it. The Stoics ran with this notion of internal freedom. They like to say that only the sage is free, and that the sage could be free even in the absence of external freedom, even if you were enslaved as chattel. But it's really the Stoics, I think, who give us an idea that works for the libertarian idea of free will. The Stoics have this thought about how every rational being has the power of assent, and it's in virtue of having the power of assent that a rational being is responsible for their judgments, their actions, their feelings. Now, for the Stoics, this power of rational assent does not operate spontaneously outside the causal order. They are rigorous causal determinists. So they're not proposing a libertarian idea of free will, but this idea of the power of assent would be, I think, useful to later philosophers who wanted to insist that there's a source of responsibility that is free from the causal order. So far as I know, nobody did that before Augustine, but I'm not really super expert in late antiquity, so can't say.
Yeah. Well, in some of Plato's dialogues, Socrates, who's kind of the mouthpiece for Plato in a lot of the dialogues, says that no one ever willingly does other than what they judge to be best. And this is related to some questions about agential control and maybe freedom. It seems, though, that in cases of weakness of will, which many people take to be quite common, that we do act contrary to how we judge best. So does Plato say more about this elsewhere? And do you think he has a settled view on the issue of the possibility of weakness of will?
Great. This is actually two great questions. And they are, in fact, linked in Plato's Protagoras, but they're not always linked. And I think we can think about them separately. So the first question is about what's meant by this claim that no one does wrong willingly. That's sometimes called the Socratic paradox.
Right.
And the other question is about whether souls can be acratic or weak of will. Let's take them independently. The claim that no one does wrong willingly, people argue about what this means. Possibly it means different things in different dialogues. Have to remember that Socrates is always engaged in a conversation, trying to persuade someone else that they should take up philosophy, always starting from the presuppositions that that other person has. Right. So can sometimes mean slightly different things in different places because he's having conversations with other people. But I'm inclined to think that usually this claim that no one does wrong willingly is linked to the idea that when a soul does the body's bidding, it's not free. It's not doing what it wants to do. So understood, the claim is about what every soul wants. Even though many of our souls are so disordered that we're not even aware of what our soul wants. Still, Socrates wants to say our souls want to be wise, and they want what is good, and they want to live well. It's just that sometimes they fail to do that. They fail to do what they want because they're enslaved to their appetites. That's the thought. Notice that claim doesn't require any particular theory about the powers or mechanisms of the human soul. Doesn't require any particular claim about agential control, for example. It just requires the thought that a rational soul, insofar as it's a rational soul and is not enslaved or confused, wants what's good. Now, the second question, the question about what I would call the question of akrasia, that's the Greek word for powerlessness, but is often called the question of weakness of will, that does seem to require a theory about how the powers and mechanisms of the soul work and how they relate to each other. This question of akrasia is also vigorously disputed, like what Plato's take is. The standard reading of Plato, which is a reading much indebted to Aristotle, Socrates gives two different answers to the question of whether akrasia is possible. Socrates, in this dialogue, the Protagoras, he denies that a person can act contrary to what they at the same time believe to be the best course of action. Their soul might be powerless in some respect, but it's still going to do what it believes to be the best course of action. But in another dialogue, the Republic, Socrates' account of the division in the soul allows him to say that a person can act contrary to what they at the same time believe to be the best course of action, because the appetitive or spirited part of the soul can overpower the rational part's judgment about what's best. Now, I think that this standard reading, this standard contrast between the Protagoras and the Republic is a bit exaggerated. It's important to note a couple of cases that the Protagoras doesn't deny. In the Protagoras, Socrates does not deny that it might appear to a person that one course of action is best, but nonetheless do otherwise. He also does not deny that a person might have what we would call a dispositional belief that one course of action is best, but nonetheless do otherwise. He's insisting only that when a person acts, the person must also believe that it's best to act in that way. The Republic does not so much disagree with that as it reinterprets it. Mm-hmm. So maybe it helps to think about a particular example. So take a case where a person has sat down with their computer to read an essay, but is tempted to play solitaire instead. If this person plays solitaire, the protagonist suggests that their soul is at least implicitly judging that it's best to play solitaire. But for all that Socrates says in the protagonist, the person's soul retains the dispositional judgment that it's best to read the essay. Indeed, Socrates explicitly allows in the protagonist that reading the essay could appear best to the person, even as they're playing solitaire. Mm-hmm. What he insists is only that the solitaire player is judging it better to play solitaire than to read the essay. And this is entirely consistent with the solitaire playing also having a contrary dispositional belief and a contrary active appearance.
Right.
After all, I mean, on any account, the solitaire player is confused. It's not perfectly wise.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, so we look at the Republic, and what part of that account does the Republic deny? And I think very little. What the Republic is after is a deeper question that the protagonist leaves untouched. And the question is this: what power causes the soul to judge when it does judge that it's best to read or to play solitaire? And what power causes the soul to desire playing solitaire when it does desire to play solitaire? And are these the same power? Now, having worked out the answer that these are different powers, if he does think that, then Socrates leaves it open to think about how best to characterize the soul as a whole or a person when they decide to read an essay, they sit down and nonetheless play solitaire. Perhaps we can even retain some of the claims of the protagonist with a little additional clarification about what we're saying and not saying to respect our new theory of the tripartite soul about these deep causal roots of these attitudes. Mm-hmm. Reasonable people could disagree about whether the clarifications needed pass over into corrections, but the view that the protagonist and the Republic represent two views so different that the same philosopher couldn't coherently hold them both strikes me as a crude mistake. I think if we ask more about what level of explanation Socrates is operating at, why he's operating at that level, we'll quickly see how he could say the one thing in one context and the other in the other without really contradicting himself.
Yeah.
That's cool. You've already mentioned this, but in some of Plato's writings, famously in the Republic, the human soul is described as having parts, and metaphors are used to depict possible interactions of the parts. Could you describe Plato's view of the soul and say a bit more about how this relates to how agents should have control in acting?
Sure. Yeah, this is a great topic. It's common sense that human souls contain a variety of mental states. If you don't like talk of soul, that's fine. Just call them minds. Human minds contain a variety of mental states. And there are a lot of ways that we could divide up these different mental states into different groups. But that's not what Plato's doing. Plato wants to divide nature at its joints. He's the source of that popular metaphor, by the way. And he thinks that you divide nature at its joints by tracking the causes or powers responsible for the variety of phenomena. So the Republic is asking whether the soul's various mental states all stem from one and the same power or from more than one power. And Socrates argues that certain cases of apparent psychological conflict can't be explained unless we recognize two powers as the sources of the conflicting attitudes. And in fact, he argues that a survey of such cases and an attempt to explain the varieties of human personality will reveal the need to recognize three powers as the sources of our various mental attitudes. So one power seeks being good and living well, and thus seeks understanding. Another power seeks being admirable. And a third seeks bodily satisfaction. The last of these, the appetitive part, is shared with non-human animals, The second, the one that seeks being admirable, that's the spirited part, and it can be found in some animals and in children as it's enmeshed in social life. And there are social animals. Mm-hmm. The first part, the rational part, that's the distinctively human part. It's what the soul is by itself when it's not embodied in animal life and enmeshed in social life. Given this division, Socrates suggests that in a well-ordered soul, to say a good soul, the parts will agree. Minimally, that means that the spirited and the penitent parts have no active desires that conflict with the rational parts' desire to live well. Now, most of us, of course, don't have well-ordered souls. We experience psychological conflict. There are different ways in which psychological conflict can go. And Socrates uses all manner of metaphor to describe these cases. And a lot of the sort of fun and frustration of reading Plato is trying to tease out these metaphors.
Right.
But their sheer variety might serve to remind us that they're merely metaphors. Maybe they can't bear too much theoretical weight.
Yeah.
He's talking with non-specialists usually. And metaphors are a good way of getting a person to imaginatively perceive something you want them to imaginatively perceive, or to feel something you want them to feel, or to think something you want them to think. The metaphors themselves are not the goal of the process. They are the vehicle to transport thinking. So some readers will find this way in which Socrates uses metaphors and leaves things under-theorized a little frustrating. And I get that, I think. But other readers will find that to be just exciting, a bit of a boon for philosophical interpretation. It's an opportunity for us to carry the thinking further instead of just being given a theory and told to take it or leave it.
Right. Well, we've been focused on issues of agency, but we also want to ask about moral responsibility. It seems that Plato thinks human beings have some control over their conduct, perhaps even over their characters, and that they're morally accountable for at least some of their actions. So, for example, the myth at the end, about the afterlife at the end of Plato's Republic seems to presuppose this sort of moral responsibility or accountability. Do you think Plato takes us to be morally responsible? And if so, does he give us any hint about the conditions on responsibility or about the scope of things that we're responsible for?
You're right. The dialogues do include, lots of talk of rewards and especially punishments, both in this life, administered by humans, and in the next life, administered by gods. But the dialogues don't offer much in the way of suggestions about how to draw a line between what we should be held accountable for and what we should not be held accountable for. His Socrates is more keen to insist that we should want to be corrected when we do wrong. That's his goal. And he's less keen to carving out cases in which we might not be responsible for having done wrong. So, look, whenever we do wrong, we didn't do wrong willingly, but it's still important to us to get corrected so that we don't do that again, so that we can make progress toward acting freely in a way that's not wrong. So the particular question of how to draw the line between when we should be held accountable and when we shouldn't, that question never really takes center stage, as it were. It kind of awaits Aristotle, who has a deeper penchant to theorize everything.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, is there anything else that we missed? Are there any other aspects of Plato's work that will be helpful as we start this series on historical thinkers and their views on freedom, responsibility, and agency?
Well, one fun and interesting strand that might be worth thinking about comes in Plato's Symposium, where Diotima teaches Socrates about what eros is. That's erotic love. And she characterizes eros as unconditional desire. Desire that's not quenchable, that rises and is relevant in every circumstance, and so on. That's eros. So this is a dangerous desire because it's so powerful, but it's not necessarily problematic. she thinks that it's totally reasonable to have an unconditional desire for unconditionally good objects. So if you have an unconditional desire to live well, that's totally reasonable. And it's totally reasonable to have unconditional desire for what's genuinely good for you, what genuinely causes you to live well. The problem is we often screw up and we make mistakes about what causes us to live well. We think that, well, if we're rich, we'll live well, or if we're powerful, we'll live well, or if we have that particular romantic partner, we'll live well. And so our erotic desire attaches to money or to fame or to power or to a particular individual, instead of remaining attached to just living well and what genuinely causes us to live well.
Yeah.
And as she thinks through how the sort of mistaken objects are mistaken, the problem with pursuing money and fame is that no matter how much you get, there's always more to get. Mm-hmm. And that's also true for knowledge, she says. That's interesting, right? So it's like, if you're just interested in accumulating bits of knowledge, there's always more you don't know. Mm-hmm. And then there's, another person, you might think, well, I can have another person as a romantic partner, but, that person turns out can't make you live well. Only you can make yourself live well. And the thing that on Diotima's suggestion that Plato's Socrates really runs with is this thought that what really makes us live well is just wisdom, because we live well when we act wisely, and so we need wisdom. Now that's an interesting little argument or way of thinking that's supposed to stimulate a case for living as a philosopher. But it's also perhaps interesting for people who are thinking about agential control or about the soul, because you might want to recognize that that there are desires, there are different kinds of desires, and that some of them might have this flavor of being unconditional, and then that unconditional desire is a threat to our freedom if it attaches to the wrong objects. Right. So you can connect Diotima's lesson to the point we were talking about earlier, that a free soul is one that does what the soul wants and doesn't do the body's bidding. There's a way in which you're unfree if you're constantly pursuing money or you're constantly pursuing fame or bits of knowledge. Whereas if you're just pursuing living well, wisely, that's you. That's you pursuing what you can do as best you can. So that escapes from enslavement. And that way of thinking was very influential on the Stoics, and I think it might be helpful to some readers today, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Well, Eric, thanks so much for joining us. If listeners want to read some of your work or follow you online, where can listeners go to find you?
Sure. I do keep an updated website, which should turn up if you just search for Eric Brown Philosophy. I also occasionally post on Blue Sky under the handle sophistuein, for the Greek word playing the sophist.
Nice.
Yeah. Thanks again, Eric. This has been great.
Thank you both very much for the honor of the invitation and the stimulus to thought.
In our next episode, we'll focus on Aristotle.